They laughed when Lonnie Vance raised 2 fingers for a $60 tiller nobody else in the yard would touch. A blind man bidding on a machine he would never lay eyes on, not then and not ever again. 40 minutes later, nobody in that yard was laughing. They were standing in a loose half-circle around him instead. Dead quiet, listening to an engine nobody alive had been able to start in 3 years turn over clean on the second pull. Glenn Ostrander had farmed the section next to the Vance place for the better part of 40 years. And he was there that September afternoon, the way he was there most consignment Saturdays. More out of habit than need. A cup of lukewarm coffee in one hand, and not much reason to be anywhere else on a Saturday morning that time of year. He didn't understand, watching it happen, what exactly he was looking at. He understood it a good deal better by the time he drove home that evening, turning it over the whole way back the way a man turns over something he can't quite finish chewing on, and better still in the years that followed, once the whole county had occasion to understand it too. This is the kind of story my father would tell, sitting on the porch after supper, taking his time getting to the part that mattered, never rushing the middle just to reach the ending sooner. If yours told stories like that too, this channel is for you. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling them. Fillmore County sits down in the bluff country of southeastern Minnesota, close enough to the Iowa line that some farmers there work ground in both states without thinking much about the border running through it. The third Saturday of September 2019 brought one of the last big consignment auctions of the season to a sale yard outside Preston, the kind of event that drew 200 people or more from 3 counties, half of them there for equipment, and the other half there mostly to visit. The morning had turned off cool and clear after a wet week, the kind of weather that made the auctioneer's voice carry sharp across the gravel lot. And the air smelled like cut hay and hot diesel, and somebody's breakfast sandwich from the lunch stand a church group ran every sale day to raise money for new hymnals. A line of folding chairs sat empty near the registration trailer until almost 10, when the older men who'd come mostly to visit finally claimed them, settling in with paper cups of coffee to watch a morning's worth of other people's equipment change hands. Rows of equipment ran the length of the yard. A Case Baller, a stack of Massey Ferguson implements, a Ford pickup with a plow mount still bolted to the front, off near the end of the row, set apart from everything else because nobody had bothered to move it closer, sat a beat-up Troy-built tiller with a cracked recoil cord, and a layer of barn dust thick enough to write your name in. Lonnie Vance walked into that sale yard the way he walked into most places, one hand light on his white cane and the other resting easy on the shoulder of a black Labrador named Scout, moving with a kind of unhurried confidence that made some people forget, for a minute at a time, that he couldn't see any of it. Most of the regulars at that sale yard knew Lonnie. He'd farmed 300 acres south of Preston his whole adult life, lost his sight gradually to a condition called retinitis pigmentosa starting in his early 30s, and kept farming anyway, the way a man does when quitting was never really a decision he was willing to make. The men who knew him nodded and said his name as he passed, the way they always did, a few of them stepping aside out of old habit before Scout even reached them. The ones who didn't, a couple of equipment dealers up from Rochester, a younger fellow flipping mowers for resale online, watched him a little too long, the way strangers do. And one of them leaned over to the man beside him and said something about the blind fellow probably just there for the company, not really bidding on anything serious. Hope somebody's helping him, the younger one said, not quite quiet enough. Not unkind, exactly, just the kind of assumption people make about a thing they've never had reason to think hard about. Lonnie heard it. He'd heard some version of it at every sale yard he'd walked into for the better part of 15 years, and it had stopped landing on him with any real weight a long time before that September. The tiller came up a little before noon, fourth from the end of a long row nobody had spent much time looking at. The consignor, an older farmer who downsized his garden plot 2 years running, said it hadn't run since his grandson tried to start it cold one spring and flooded the carburetor so badly he'd given up on it entirely. The auctioneer didn't waste much breath on it. He called it scrap weight, more or less, said somebody might get a season's worth of parts off it if nothing else, and asked who'd give him $60 to clear it off the trailer. A couple of hands went up half-heartedly and dropped again when nobody pushed past that number. The kind of lukewarm bidding that tells an auctioneer everything he needs to know about a lot before he's even finished describing it. Lonnie raised 2 fingers, the signal he and the auctioneer had worked out years before for a bid he meant to hold. The auctioneer, who knew him, called it without much ceremony. A ripple of low laughter went through the small knot of people standing nearest the trailer, quiet enough that Lonnie couldn't have said for certain who it came from, though he had a fair guess. $60 for $300 worth of dead iron, by the consignor's own asking price 2 years before, came out to roughly 20 cents on the dollar. The kind of number that told most of that crowd everything they needed to know about what the machine was actually worth. Most of his neighbors had long since stopped marveling at the daily version of it. The part that didn't make for much of a story because nobody happened to be standing around watching when it happened. Lonnie still ran 300 acres of corn and soybeans the way he'd run them for years, navigating fence lines and field edges by memory and feel, judging a tractor's line down a row by the sound of the engine note against his own ear and the pull of the wheel against his palms. He could tell a clogged planter unit by the rhythm of the chain alone, 3 rows out, before anybody riding beside him with 2 good eyes would have thought to look. None of that made the news. It was just Tuesday, the way most of the hardest things a person learns to do eventually just become Tuesday, if they stick with it long enough. What the crowd standing around that trailer didn't know, because there wasn't any way for them to know it just by looking, was that Lonnie hadn't bid on that tiller blind in the way most of them assumed the word meant. He'd had his grandson walk him down the row 20 minutes earlier, not for a description of how anything looked, but so Lonnie could run his hands over each machine in turn. Engine block, carburetor body, recoil housing, spark plug boot, feeling for the particular signs that told him more than a glance ever told a sighted man standing 6 feet back with his hands in his pockets. He'd found the tiller, traced the carburetor with 2 fingers, smelled old gas gone to varnish at the float bowl, and felt a stiffness in the recoil pull that told him the engine wasn't seized, just fouled and stubborn. He'd known, standing there with his hand still on the cold metal, that $60 was the safest bet in that whole sale yard. Lonnie had not always known how to read a machine that way. He'd been a sighted mechanic once, in the ordinary sense, before the disease took his vision a degree at a time across most of his 30s, narrowing his world down from the edges inward until there wasn't much left but a small, bright circle that finally closed too. The doctors had warned him it might happen that way. Slow at first and then faster. And Lonnie had spent the last few years he could still see anything at all, trying not to think too hard about what came after. His father, Del Vance, had farmed before him and kept a shop full of half-running equipment his whole life. And it was Del, more than anyone, who refused to let Lonnie's hands go idle once his eyes stopped being useful. Del would stand beside him in the shop those first hard years and talk him through an engine the way another man might talk a blind person through a room. This is the carburetor. This is the float. Feel here, feel here. Until Lonnie's fingers started doing on their own what his eyes used to do for him, without his ever once having to think about it. It was slow, humbling work at first. Lonnie dropped more bolts in those early months than he could ever account for. And more than once he sat down on the shop floor in frustration and told his father he didn't see the point in trying. A poor choice of words neither of them ever laughed about until years later. Del died in the winter of 2003, before Lonnie's hands had fully finished learning the trade his father had started teaching him, and Lonnie spent the better part of a decade after that finishing the lesson alone, mostly by trial, mostly in that same shop. mostly without anybody watching. What Lonnie understood by the time he was crouched in a sale yard outside Preston in September of 2019 was something most sighted mechanics never had any particular reason to learn. An engine that won't start is rarely silent about why. A flooded carburetor smells different from a dry one, sharper, almost sweet at the edges, where raw gas has sat too long against warm metal. A seized piston resists a pull cord with a dead, immovable weight, while a fouled one resists with a stickiness that gives, just slightly if you're patient with it, the way a stuck drawer gives before it finally slides. A spark plug with carbon buildup feels gritty under a thumbnail in a way a clean one never does. And the gap between the electrodes tells a practiced finger almost as much as a feeler gauge would tell an eye. Sighted men, Lonnie had come to believe, leaned so hard on their eyes that they stopped noticing half of what their other senses were telling them the whole time. The way a person stops hearing a clock ticking in a room they sit in every day. He'd lost the thing most mechanics built their whole trade around. He'd gained, in its place, 4 other ways of asking the same questions, and he'd had 11 years longer than most men to get good at listening to the answers. He pulled the spark plug first, right there at the trailer, working by feel with a wrench while Scout's leash stayed looped loosely around his own wrist the whole time. The dog sitting patient in the gravel beside him, like he'd done this 100 times before, because he had. The plug came out fouled black and wet, exactly the way the smell at the float bowl had told him it would be. He held it up between 2 fingers for a second, not for anybody else's benefit, just out of old habit, then cleaned it with a rag from his back pocket in slow, even strokes. He dried the carburetor bowl with that same patient, unhurried motion he used on everything, blew through the jet to clear it, and primed the bulb twice before setting the plug back in its boot. A few more people had drifted over by then, drawn the way a crowd always drifts toward something it doesn't understand yet, until there were a dozen or more standing in a loose half-circle 3 and 4 deep around the trailer. Glenn Ostrander stood near the front of them, arms crossed, watching Lonnie's hands move with a kind of certainty that made the watching feel almost like trespassing. "Lonnie," Glenn said once, quiet. "You sure that thing's even worth the trouble?" Lonnie didn't look up, because there wasn't anywhere for him to look. "Worth finding out," he said, and went back to work. One of the dealers from Rochester had gone quiet by then, too. His earlier comment about the company sitting a little heavier on him than it had 20 minutes before. He gave the recoil cord 1 long pull to clear the cylinder, a second to prime it, and on the third, the little engine caught, sputtered, and steadied into a clean, even idle that carried clear across a sale yard that had gone almost entirely quiet around it, the regular bidding chatter further down the row sounding strangely far away now. Nobody said much of anything for a few seconds. The auctioneer's voice kept going somewhere down the row, oblivious, calling the next lot, and the tiller just kept running underneath it. The dumbest, most ordinary sound in the world. And somehow the only sound anybody standing near that trailer seemed to be paying attention to. Glenn Ostrander would say later that it wasn't the running engine itself that got to him. It was watching a man do it without once needing to see what he was doing. Word about it moved through Fillmore County the way word moves through a place that size, fast and a little distorted by the 3rd or 4th telling, until half the county had heard some version of the blind man who fixed a tiller nobody else could touch. The calls started within the month. A neighbor with a baler that kept throwing belts for no reason anybody could find. A young couple who'd bought a fixer-up tractor online and couldn't get it past a stubborn miss at idle. Lonnie didn't advertise. He didn't need to. He worked most jobs the same unhurried way he'd worked that tiller. Hands first, ears second, and more often than the men bringing him their equipment expected, he found the thing they'd missed. The job that settled his reputation for good came that November, when a dealer in Spring Valley named Russ Ball called about a used skid steer that had been sitting in his lot for 6 weeks, running rough enough that 2 of his own certified mechanics had given up on it and chalked the loss up against the sale price. Russ brought it out to Lonnie's shop on a flatbed more out of desperation than confidence, expecting, by his own later admission, to waste an afternoon proving to himself he'd tried everything before scrapping the engine for parts. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed while Lonnie worked, the same skeptical posture Glenn Ostrander had stood in back in September. The posture men in that part of the world reserve for things they haven't decided yet whether to believe. Lonnie spent 20 minutes with his hands on the fuel lines and the injector body before he found it. A hairline crack in a fuel return line, hidden under a wiring harness where neither mechanic had thought to run a bare finger, weeping just enough diesel under pressure to throw the whole system's timing off without ever showing a visible leak. Russ Ball stood in that shop doorway for a long moment after Lonnie told him what he'd found, not saying much, doing the math on 6 weeks of his own mechanic's labor against 20 minutes of a blind man's hands. He started sending Lonnie his stumped equipment after that, paying him a flat fee that came to more some months than the row crops on Lonnie's own 300 acres. By 2022, Lonnie had built a small shop onto the side of his machine shed, mostly so people had somewhere dry to wait while he worked, and started taking on his oldest grandson, a boy of 15 named Caleb, who wanted to learn the trade the same patient way Lonnie had learned it from Dell 2 decades before. Caleb had good eyes and no particular reason to learn any other way of working, and Lonnie made him close them anyway for the first month of lessons, the same way Dell once stood beside him in that same shop and said, "Feel here. Feel here," until the boy started trusting his own hands the way his grandfather had eventually trusted his. Caleb complained about it at first, the way any 15-year-old complains about a thing that doesn't make sense to him yet, until the day he diagnosed a sticking valve on a neighbor's mower with his eyes shut and his grandfather standing silent beside him, not saying a word until the boy got it right on his own. A trade magazine ran a short piece on him the following year, more curiosity than business feature. A reporter from Minneapolis driving down to spend an afternoon in the shop watching Lonnie work through a stubborn alternator problem on a neighbor's combine. The piece ran under a photograph of his hands resting flat against an engine block, and it brought him a handful of calls from outside the county that he mostly turned down, preferring the work close enough to home that Scout could still walk the route between trailer and shop without anybody having to think twice about it. A community college an hour north asked if he'd come talk to a small engine repair class one semester, and he went, more out of obligation than enthusiasm, standing at the front of a room he couldn't see and somehow holding every student's attention better than most of their actual instructors managed, and ended up going back twice more after that because the students kept asking him to. Glenn Ostrander still tells the story when it comes up, usually starting with the part about the laugh that went around that trailer before the bidding closed. The equipment dealers from Rochester who didn't know any better. The way the yard went so quiet after that engine caught that a man could have heard a sparrow land on the fence 2 rows over. He says it without much embellishment, the way a story doesn't need much once the bones of it are true. He'll tell you, if you let him finish, that he learned something out in that sale yard he hadn't expected to learn at his age. Watching a blind man find what an engine was trying to say long before anybody with 2 good eyes had thought to ask it a question. Lonnie doesn't think of that September afternoon as much of a turning point, not the way the people telling the story usually do. He's never been much for marking occasions that way, even the ones other people insist on marking for him. He'd been doing the same work, the same way, for years before anybody outside Fillmore County had occasion to notice. What changed wasn't the work. It was just that for once, a whole crowd of strangers happened to be standing close enough and quiet enough to watch the answer arrive in real time instead of taking somebody's word for it after the fact. Most of what passes for sight, Lonnie told Glenn once, isn't seeing at all. It's just paying attention. He'd just had more practice doing it without the shortcut everybody else still leaned on.